Welcome to The Drummer and the Great Mountain, a podcast where we share effective tips and practices for working with adult ADD, ADHD in a natural, effective way without the use of medications. Each episode, join me, your host, Bahman Sarram, along with the author of The Drummer and the Great Mountain, Michael Joseph Ferguson. Join Michael and myself in an interactive discussion of sharing our stories as we journey together in transforming what can be the gift of being what we call hunter types. This podcast is intended to be your audio companion to the book written by Michael, who joins me each episode where we both will strive to foster dialogue, give you our personal insights, and share both of our experiences on this similar path that we are all on. Our intention and hope is that along with the book, this podcast gives you an additional perspective as you listen to us delve deeper into each chapter of the book to give you even more tools to go along with what it is that you are reading. Visit us at drummerandthegreatmountain.com to purchase the book and look for more tools, tips, and updates, as well as giving us feedback on this podcast. Join our growing global community of creative types, entrepreneurs, and out-of-the-box thinkers on our shared journey. Welcome to The Drummer and the Great Mountain podcast. Hello, friends, and welcome once again to The Drummer and the Great Mountain. This is the podcast and audio guide to the Guidebook to Transforming Adult ADD ADHD by Michael Joseph Ferguson. Once again, I'm your host, Bahman Sarram, here with you to loosely walk you through, along with the author of The Drummer and the Great Mountain, Michael, who joins me every week. Onwards and upwards we go. We've covered everything in the book itself up to this point, and today we're going to kind of keep it loose. Today, Michael felt that it would be good, and I love the concept of this, which is for you to get to know some of his inspirations of where this book came from. So think of this as an audio bibliography, if you will, the many streams that fed into the book that you're reading and the topics that inspire this podcast that you're listening to. I'd like to start out. It's been just about a couple weeks probably since our last episode went up, and I just want to personally thank everybody out in the community for all your support of the podcast, which is my role in this world of Drummer and the Great Mountain. And it has been an absolute pleasure, and it has been inspiring, and especially to see this service. It's still early, coffee hasn't kicked in. This service that Michael and I provide through the podcast, and it didn't. We had no plans. We had no. We had some plans. We didn't have strict, bulleted points of what this podcast was going to be. That's actually one of the promises we made to each other. It is through hearing back from you. It is through that cultivation of this community, this hunter community, that we've built it up to what it is today. This podcast started out kind of as we're just going to do it. We're going to cover the chapters. And it's turned out that our role organically has developed into it as a different lens to see this topic of adult ADD, ADHD, hunter type, whatever it is you see it as, yourself as, or it's someone you care about, which is why you've tuned in here. It's a different lens, and that has been the ultimate unplanned, organic role that we have played, and it's been a pleasure because that, in the end, is what we've done here, and we plan now on continuing to give you that different lens. So those are my thank yous, obviously, to Michael for giving me this role to play and be part of this, and look forward to seeing you all. And Michael's going to have his own thank yous here in a minute before we get to the bibliography topic, if you will. But a couple announcements, as always. Want to let you know, we know the last probably podcast you listened to, we had mentioned a webinar coming up, and if you were on the email list for that webinar, you know we had to postpone it temporarily, but it's for a good reason. We had technical issues with how it was all being put together. We ran some tests, actually, Michael and I both being technical folks in our other life, and it didn't pass our technical muster. It didn't pass our tests. So our goal, if we're going to do a webinar with you, is to create the best experience we can. So stay tuned. It is coming up. We are back on the path, and so just stay tuned to the website, this podcast, for any and all announcements regarding the webinar. I know I personally am excited to see you all for that, hear you all for the webinar. Michael's got a talk coming up at the Dove Library in Carlsbad. That's this Tuesday, November 3rd, depending on when you're listening to this podcast. But either way, know that Michael is out there. As we said, events are coming up, and this is going to be the first of many at the Dove Library in Carlsbad at 12:30 p.m. on November 3rd. See the website for details. Other than that, since we're keeping it loose, let's bring in the man himself. Good morning, my friend. How are you?
Thanks. I like how I feel so important whenever I'm on this podcast.
It was part of my.
It
It was part of my contract. Whenever I introduce you, to make you feel important.
That's right. I feel very important.
I remember you negotiated heavy for that. Yeah.
That's right. I've got to be the star.
That's right.
Oh, that's hilarious. So yeah, first I want to thank you once again, and I know a lot of people have chimed in and sent feedback, and they really appreciate your voice on the podcast. And I know you've had some big wins this last couple of weeks. We do coaching together, and I'm just overall it's an honor to be working with you, and it's also just phenomenal to see the wins that you've had this last year. It really keeps me sparked and moving on this work.
Yeah, well, I think this podcast, since we're on it and we're talking on it, I think it's part of the inspiration. I think it's part of the overall good year for all of us in the community who've discovered Drummer in the Great Mountain. To be honest with you, there's no bias there. I think it's a benefit for all of us, and this podcast is definitely definitely part of that. It's given me a purpose, but it's also been really inspirational to see that what we're doing is having effect. It really truly is, and that's not an egoic stroke in any means. It is a compliment to those out there who are taking initiative and into their self-realization path when it comes to being a hunter type.
It's really, when I started on this, I don't know, 5 years ago now, it's kind of been floating around in my brain for a while that there was this missing piece as far as a perspective on adult ADD, and I wasn't sure if I was going to write it, or I knew it was going to take a lot of work, and then at some point I just saw that it wasn't going to happen in at least from the perspective that I think I had developed over time, and had no idea whether or not anyone would be interested at all. And so actually reading the notes and the replies and seeing you and a lot of the coaching clients that I've worked with over the past few years, it's just amazing to see how the information itself is very liberating. And it's based on, I think, what is actual truth. I think we have a specific wiring, and there's no disorder, it's a neurological type. And when we embrace that and we find ways to shift our lives around a little bit, including letting go of judgments and things that have maybe held us back, just so many things open up. And so it's wonderful. Like, it's the best work. I'm so grateful for it, and I'm grateful again to everyone listening. I want to do a couple shout outs.
Yep.
One, I want to say a shout out to Cuesta, who's my fiance, and so she is on the support team, one of the many people on the support team, but she's primary. She handles all the orders. She has helped tremendously in the writing and the creation of all the material that goes out. So I want a big shout out to her. She's phenomenal. And all of the support team, there's so many people that have contributed to the book and continue to contribute to promotion, and just people sharing on Facebook and getting the word out. So I'm grateful for everyone. I want to do some specific shout outs to people that we've been exchanging back and forth with. John in Hong Kong, I know you're listening. Thank you so much for being patient with your books. I know it took a lot longer to get there. Thank you for the suggestions you've been sending out. Much appreciated. Uh, Thank you to David and the Canadians, all the Canadians out there. Appreciate you guys for even letting us know that there's a Canadian audience for the book and the podcast. And let's see, I spoke to Tom recently on Twitter, who's was connected to the Hunter School, Thom Hartmann's Hunter School. Thank you for tuning in. And I think as far as shout outs, that was it. And then I also want to, given the last week's podcast, I guess probably 2 weeks ago, on addiction, definitely check out Mark Maron's WTF podcast. There was an interview with James Taylor. I think it was last week, musician James Taylor.
Absolutely.
And he really goes into the specifics of his life, some of the challenges he's had with heroin, and just why, when he started exercising and all the things that he did, like he found that like he was wired a certain way, and once he started to embrace that and click in with it, it really changed it was able to manage that. And I think depending on where you are in that journey, it's such a good interview because someone came out the other side of recovery, but had a very similar perspective, have kind of stumbled on a lot of the things that we are talking about here. So I highly encourage you to listen to it. WTF is such a phenomenal podcast. Definitely check it out.
I was listening to that in the background at work when it first aired. I'm subscribed to the podcast, so it popped up. I'm like, my God, the idol, James Taylor of idols. And it was playing in the background, but I remember that's when I popped up, like really sat up and started really listening. And I heard him using that phrasing, the wiring phrasing, which is something you refer to in the book and we refer to here. And, we're a bigger community than you may realize. We talk about us on this podcast and our audience and those by reading the book and following the program here being a community, but we're a much bigger community than you may even think. And these ties, these threads are, these threads are all around. I want to talk for a second before we get into the bibliography here and bring us into that, because I know we want to jump into that, about, I remember, we may have mentioned this very early on, but I think here in kind of a recap type of mode, one of the first times I met you, it probably was the second time I had met you. It may have actually been the first, was at an artist get-together. I remember somebody was doing a one-woman show on her topic of what she does, and it's something about empowering women who are single mothers, I think is what it is, following a spiritual path, and she's a yogi. So she had a little party at her house before the premiere, and you and I met through a very good friend of ours, an amazing artist by the name of Ari Marsh, who's an author, musician, all of it. And I remember, first of all, by the very first instant we met, my fiance at the time was there. I just remember we had an instant connection. I definitely remember that. I just remember just the way you talked. I was like, there's something about this guy. And it wasn't 3 sentences in, you mentioned this project you're working on, which was this book. And here we are. I can't believe it's almost 5 years later. There's just no way time flies like that. And it is amazing just to, and why do I mention this? This is not just pats on the back. This is for our audience, related to everything we've talked about. That as a hunter type, you're going to have certain goals more than others that seem like a mountain that you're climbing, ironically enough. But following what makes you best, what puts you at your best, and putting yourself in the best position, the project will get done. It will get done well. Just follow the and this book is the realization of someone who went through the process in order to write the book, and here we are with a book and a podcast and everything. With that in mind, I think the very opening, the introduction will kind of get us into what we need to today so we can get in on our topics. And that's what you wrote in the introduction, which says, this book starts with the assumption that you're more interested in living a fulfilling life than you are in just treating symptoms. Yet, another method of, quote, fixing yourself is not what you're after. It also presupposes that there may be effective, natural, non-pharmaceutical means of minimizing your challenges with focus, consistency, motivation, and hyperactivity. Perfect opening paragraph and intro to your book, and it's why we are here today and where we are. So get us into the streams, because I think it'll be interesting for people, and I know we're keeping it loose, but just I think it's interesting for people to know the bibliography. They're going to find that, except for maybe one, they're not directly related to necessarily ADD, ADHD, which is what I think makes this book so wide open to a vast audience.
Yes, as I was going through and putting together some of the notes for this podcast, I was looking through, and really Thom Hartmann's the only one, at least that we'll mention today, that had anything to do with writing specifically about ADD. I tried to pull in a lot of other sources because I felt like I wanted this book to be like a personal growth book. I wanted it to be something that, you keep it by your side. It's going to last a number of years, and it's not just about just do this, don't do this. It had a little bit more depth to it, because it's how we perceive ourselves and sort of the mythology around how we view the world has such a huge impact on how we move through it. And we're not computers. We're not like machines. We actually need some spiritual component in that. Even to my atheist friends out there, that could just be just how you perceive the world. How does the world function, and how you fit inside that world? And so we're going to talk a lot about that today, because I think that really it cuts to those deeper parts of ourselves, because there's always, I think, so far you can go with, okay, I need to eat this, I shouldn't eat this, I need to exercise, or I shouldn't, that's all periphery to actually that deep thing that drives you to motivate yourself to create things and to engage with certain people and to pursue the life you're here to live. And so I think that's the more important piece. And so I just want to go through some of the inspiration for the book, and some of it will be medical, but most of it will be just people that inspired me along the journey, and I think could be a support to you. So the first one, and has to be the first one, is Thom Hartmann, who came up with the hunter-farmer theory. The book was Attention Deficit Disorder: A Different Perspective. I think that was 92. He's written many great books on adult ADD. Highly recommended. He's also known as he has a talk show. There's a lot of he occasionally will cover this topic on the talk show. Can't say enough. Don't know. I still just don't know how he came up with the theory. Like, it was such a jump in logic from everything that was out there. So it's just amazing to see, after now from 92, how many years is that? That's over 20 years. It's still around. It's still gaining traction, and I'm hoping this podcast really puts the hunter-farmer theory of adult ADD, or of ADD, ADHD, in the forefront, because I think it is such an accurate model. It really helps people, and it's easily adopted. So definitely just Google Thom Hartmann, go to Amazon, pick up some of his books. The Edison Gene's really good. There's a couple of new ones that I actually have not read, so definitely check him out. And I might actually go back and grab a couple of those. We might do reviews in the future on a few of them. So that's Thom Hartmann. Dr. Kevin McCauley, another huge influence on especially the addiction pieces, but the brain chemistry chapter was very influenced by his work, and then picking up on his resources and doing research on his references. There's a we're going to add links in the podcast notes, so you can actually go and click on a few things here. There's a series that he did on YouTube's videos on explaining addiction, explaining how addiction works and how certain people are more affected by it. It is outstanding, very much worth watching. They're very easy to watch, and it specifically goes into understanding how dopamine works and why certain chemicals or even experiences cue dopamine release, and why that it potentially creates a higher aptitude towards addiction. And then from that material, I was able to then see the connection between adult ADD, which there's a very high rate of self-medication, and how that relates to dopamine. Very key piece in my research. So check the podcast notes, check out those videos. I'm going to also put one in there where he talks about the connection between stress and how that perpetuates addiction. So those are very important pieces. Even if you yourself don't struggle with it, as a human being, it's good to understand these pieces so you can maybe support someone down the road who may need that kind of information and support. The next one is the mood cure. We've mentioned this numerous times. Julia Ross. A lot of the dietary suggestions and just understanding how amino acids and protein affect brain chemistry. It's all in there. That is an excellent book. Pick it up. It should really be in your library. To have it, she has actually quizzes in the book that will give you an idea of what specifically is going on neurologically, biochemically, depending on if you have like kind of the dark cloud, which is sort of the low serotonin. There's questions that you can fill out, and it'll tell you if that those are some of the areas that you're challenged with and what to do about it. Definitely the ADD piece is in there as well. Definitely check it out. And she also runs a clinic, I believe, in the Marin area. So and primarily she works with people who are doing recovery, but I also know she works with people that also do that are doing weight loss and want to understand how the food addiction piece is connected in with it.
I have to chime in there
Sure.
on that. I mentioned more than a handful of times about giving credit where it's due to the concept of food addiction, and the things you brought into the book and into this program with inspired by Julia Ross and the Mood Cure, really spoke to me. Never been hooked on a drug, never been hooked on alcohol. Don't really enjoy alcohol much as a vice. But since childhood, for many different Freudian psychological reasons, food was the comfort. Food was there when I was sad. Food was there when I was happy. And as a hunter type, if you just so happen to be tuning in just now or recently and didn't catch episodes where I mentioned this, I cannot emphasize now, whether you're food addicted or not, that what turned it all around for me, no doubt, was addressing the two major pieces, which are diet and exercise. And I think if I had to put them in priority, it was the food first, because once you start changing the fuel you're feeding your engine, you're going to have the energy to get into a routine for an exercise program. And it's really interesting you mentioned the concept of this dark cloud, because what happened for me as an inspiration for people out there who are going through this process now. And by the way, whenever I mention something I've done or am doing, it's never complete. It is never. It's an ongoing process, and that's exactly what I want to talk about. You know, if you have a partner who's tuned into you as you're going through this process, through this transformation process, there are days that on a dime I can walk in the door, and my wonderful, supportive, amazing wife, who I wonder sometimes how I got so lucky, and I don't say that just to pander. It's truly true. She literally says, I see a little... I mean, she said this before you mentioned this, before this book came into my life. There's a little cloud over your head. What's going on? And I tell you, now that I've gotten on the path towards good diet, especially for a hunter type, 9 out of 10 times she is right that she sees the cloud. It's an aura thing. And I can tell you, I didn't eat well that day for whatever reason. So that's where I'm saying it's not a complete thing. But what happens is once in its relation to mood and the Mood Cure by Julia Ross, is it's amazing once you do get on the path that it only takes being off a little, and we're all allowed to be off a little. We're all allowed to cheat a little bit. But it's amazing when you do, your body becomes even more sensitive to that. Whereas, I mean, if you're dumping a whole bunch of toxins, who's going to notice the difference? But she'll wake me up to, I was stressed out at work today. There was that buffet that was left over. I had something I shouldn't have had. Boom! It sets the mood for when I come home. So this is a true thing as someone who's just witnessed to it. So the tie to diet and mood is 100%. a hunter type thing to overcome and transform. So I just wanted to chime in on that. That was very true for me.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, that's it. And it's interesting, like having, because I know you and I've worked with you quite a bit, and then I've worked with other hunter types, and some people really have the dark cloud, like it's the deep depression. And if you have that, again, it's really important to understand a few of these pieces, especially the protein piece of it. I've just watched people just transform so quickly once they understand that, oh, wow, I'm eating mostly carbs. And just having fish 3 times a week and cutting down the carbs, it's tremendous how quickly people's mood changes. And then you add exercise to it, and that dark cloud, the difference between making that change versus going on antidepressants is it's a little more liberating, and you're also helping your body. And there's so many other pieces that it's so worth taking the time to support your brain chemistry and your health in a way that doesn't require you going on something that may have a lot of side effects.
Well, it's
And
interesting that it's.
may start.
Sorry, go ahead.
And one other thing that may have long-term negative impact on your brain chemistry.
Well, and that's the whole thing. The brain chemistry part and approaching things from a non-pharmaceutical standpoint is when you get good at this, and being good at this is a subjective term. I use it subjectively because we've always said what works for you is going to be what works for you in transforming yourself.
Yeah.
But I'll speak again for me is, so now you have that cloud over your head because maybe you didn't eat the right snack, or you just, you ate something for, well, it takes a while for that food to digest. That sets off certain chemicals which may lead to the dark cloud. Right away, we know then for dinner that night, there's no exceptions. We turn to the poultry, or we turn to a low-carb, veggie, non-meat, or we're finding as a household, we're finding our rhythm, if you will. And I'm telling you, then with a good dinner, by bedtime, 10 out of 10 times, I say to her, I'm back. I literally feel like I'm back.
Yeah.
Cloud lifted, and I'm back. So it's just reiterating your point.
It happens fast, yeah. And then I definitely want to do a shout out to all the vegetarians and vegans out there, because I've been a vegetarian for 20 years. Only the last 3 years have I been doing fish, and I haven't even noticed that big a difference, because once I dialed in a high protein, complete protein diet, it really, for most people, I can't say for everyone, because there's certain people that meat seems to be, just from personal experience watching coaching clients, some people seem to need meat in order for their brain to function optimally and to not go into it. And I feel really bad saying that, because I've been in this world for a long time and I want to be proved differently, and I'm really open to it. But from my personal experience, I've seen there's certain percentage of people seem to need it, or they really go down. But what I will say is that a high percentage of people can go to a vegetarian or even vegan diet and feel great and do really well, provided they're really monitoring that they're getting enough amino acids so that their body can function well. So I really want to just state that, because I think the vegan vegetarian diet overall is so good for the planet. It's so good for so many of the industries that are harming the planet have to do with factory farming and things that really are not, they're not good to our fellow animals on this earth, but they're also not good for just the ecology of the earth. So that's why in the book, many of you read the book, I really push organic, free range, from even just from a health, not even from a compassion place, which is very important, but just from a health place. It's a feedback loop. When you take care of the earth, it has a positive side effect of helping us as well. So maybe we'll switch over. I'm going in different order here. I might go to permaculture.
Yeah, let's get to that. I was actually going to suggest that, especially getting to that.
I feel like that's a good segue.
Yep.
So one of the books in the bibliography, actually met the author a couple weeks ago, which is a great honor. So there's a book called Gaia's Garden, It is called a Home Scale Guide to Permaculture, and the author is Toby Hemingway. And permaculture, as you've maybe heard before, I have a huge respect for and have been studying for the last 12 years. And basically, permaculture is the study of how to create sustainable ecosystems. So the example I always give is a forest doesn't need us to truck in fertilizer and do all these things for it to keep going, and we don't need to water it. It functions on its own as a sustainable ecosystem. And so the principles involved in how you create a sustainable ecosystem is where that's the study of permaculture. And so these same principles can then be superimposed on looking at your own life and how your home, because you are part of the ecosystem. We have sprung out of the ecosystem of the planet, and understanding how nature functions helps us understand how we function better, especially our physical bodies. And so I would highly recommend Gaia's Garden. I've read it over and over and over again. It is such a good book. It is primarily a gardening book, but the concepts, as you read it, you start to make connections within your own life, because it's such a clear lens of like, here's how nature works, but you can easily then flip it over and go, this is how the systems in my life function, and how can I fine tune those? So there's 12 permaculture design principles that are covered in that book, but there's also a new book that he just came out with called The Permaculture City. And you can actually go to YouTube and look at, there's a few talks of him discussing it. I've also referenced him in he goes back and talks about the beginnings of humanity and civilization, and a lot of the pieces that balanced out the view of hunter-farmer theory, of just understanding how do we go from being hunter-gatherers to having civilization, and understanding the steps that we took, and maybe some of the mistakes we made on our evolutionary path, and how do we get back to some of those pieces that fed our bodies more efficiently. All these pieces, Toby Hemingway is brilliant. The permaculture movement is amazing. Highly recommend, especially for hunter types. I think it's something that hunter types can really appreciate, because it has there's a deal of complexity to it, but it's very engaging, and it pulls in a lot of different. And I think the hunter type brain is really, from what I've seen, can really embrace it and understand it and take it in. So highly recommend checking out Permaculture and Toby Hemingway's book.
Excellent.
Okay, so let's just to wrap up here. I want to just go through a couple more. I don't want to make this too long.
Sure.
The title of the book came from Michael Meade, and we've mentioned him before. It's Meade. Michael Meade's one of the great elders of our planet. He's a great human being. He has done amazing work. He's doing a lot of the work that other people aren't doing. That he's picking up the pieces in people's lives that I think get lost along the way. So specifically, he has an organization called Mosaic Voices. It's mosaicvoices.org. He works with at-risk teens and basically connects them with people who are elders who've been in communities and supporting, basically who've gone through their own journey and some of them have been through addiction and back, and they basically hold space for young adults that are basically at risk, that are kind of on the edges. Probably many of them are hunter types, and give them the space to vent their anger, their frustration, their fears, and they try to do it within the context of music and poetry and self-expression. And what seems to happen to these kids as they go through this is, as they're seen and witnessed and heard for their pain, and just seen for who they are, they instantly kind of just become transformed into these beings that want to serve and support other people. And Michael Meade's work it's so hard to even categorize what he does, because he seems to have taken the wisdom traditions from many different, so he studies the mythologies from many different cultures, their indigenous traditions, and he synthesizes them in a way that comes through as he does workshops, and he shares poetry, and he creates this it's hard to describe. It creates a context that doesn't really exist anywhere else. I've never seen anyone do what he does. So long and short, he's written a number of books. There's a number of his talks and lectures on YouTube. It's non-denominational. People from all faiths or no faiths can listen and get very nourished by him. He's one of the people that started what's called the men's group movement, which happened like in the 70s and 80s and 90s. It's kind of ebbed and waned as time has gone on, but really supporting specifically men in finding the pain and the grief and the challenges that come from being a male in this society, in a way that actually makes men more compassionate, kind, and better partners. And I can't say enough. So his counterpart, Michael Meade, I would say, is Clarissa Pinkola Estes. So for the women out there, she's a powerhouse. She's written a lot of books, and she in many ways is the counterpart to Michael Meade. She covers a lot of the female traditions. She wrote a book called Women That Run with the Wolves. Excellent resource. Just to get to understand that kind of world of mythology and just seeing yourself in a maybe slightly larger context. These are people to definitely check out, along with, I would say, Robert Bly, who is actually came before them. He wrote a book called Iron John. He's a poet laureate. He's another just great elder. Definitely, and definitely check out some of his talks if you can find them. So I would say Michael Meade. Check out mosaicvoices.org, and also if you check the notes for the podcast, you'll see there's a couple of YouTube videos that I'll connect you to.
Yeah, I mean, what a beautiful. I mean, you mentioned Michael Meade as you called him an elder, and I love the description of that. And I just want to point out, this is just purely hearing what you said from an observational standpoint, which is the venting, the space for venting, which Michael provides in these. This is so critical to. It's critical to everyone as a human being, but let me just focus a little bit from a hunter type perspective, with no expertise in mind, but rather just having gone through it. A lot of what you talk about in your book, the ups and downs of being a hunter type, especially the frustration and what I call the peaks in the graph, when we get frustrated with life or whatever it is, especially when we're kind of all over the place, the untransformed hunter type. A lot of the key to your healing, a lot of the key to your transformation, you'll see, is once you start getting things going, again, with the diet and exercise and all that we've talked about, because this affects your mood, is that even when you're in the groove, you have to release. You have to release. And sometimes exercise is just not enough. It helps, because if you didn't, you'd really be in a bad place. But releasing some of this stuff is what kind of gets, I don't know, I can't answer what happens with the brain chemistry of chicken or the egg, which is you're kind of all over the place, unfocused. So that's why you get frustrated and maybe have these peaks in the graph. Which comes first, I don't know. All I do know is when everything's kind of humming and everything's kind of grooving, part of that is that release. I've mentioned to you that
Yes.
to me, this is where life coach comes in. You've mentioned it before, and if it's not an official life coach, if it's not someone you're officially paying for, having that person who's there with you through this process. Maybe you don't have a Michael Meade in your life, but having that person that's checking in on you, that release is key to the path. To me,
Absolutely.
just from where I come from.
That's it. That's such a good point. It's being seen and heard without judgment.
Yes, and that's the part I always forget. That's the whole key. Yes.
Yeah.
It's the without judgment part.
Without judgment.
Because there are and I've spoken about my culture before. In my culture, people hear you, but man, oh man. Yes, there's an oversensitivity. I feel like it's a big fat Greek wedding in the Persian culture too. It's like they hear you, but when they come back at you, you're like, oh no, who did I just open up to? Let me brace. I'm going to brace for the judgment. Here it comes. And sometimes it's almost passive aggressive. It's like, oh, I hear you. Gee, I wonder if you're in this situation because you never listened to me. I mean, it's like it comes across in like this passive aggressive, maybe more aggressive judge. But when you have someone, out of all seriousness, that is like, okay, so that sounds like a challenge. What can we do about it and come up with a plan? Well said. Moving on.
And that's a perfect segue into Marshall Rosenberg. So we
Yes.
mentioned there's a whole the chapter of navigating emotions, the podcast. If you go back and look at it, it's still online on navigating emotions. It's all based on the work of nonviolent communication by Dr. Marshall Rosenberg, which the entire process is about non-judgment and compassionate listening to other people as well as yourself. So there's a whole podcast on it. We don't need to go for it here. Just go listen to it. It is outstanding work. There's nonviolent communication groups in just about every city, no matter it is non-denominational. Everything that I've tried to put in here has anyone can interface with this information. Um, it's outstanding work. It takes practice, and the nonviolent communication groups. It's basically it's like a study group, and then you practice the process. They themselves can be a source of support and listening that you may be craving right now. So I would say go to ncnvc.org, and it shows you all the different groups and where they are. Some are like a small donation to jump in. Some are free. Definitely check it out. The book, there's basically a book called Nonviolent Communication. I think Compassionate Listening or Compassionate Dialogue. I don't know the exact name of the book. It's changed since I've gotten the first book. Definitely check that out. Check out that podcast. And just to cover a couple more, and then we'll wrap up here. Sonia Choquette's Your Heart's Desire. That's a book by Sonia Choquette. Excellent resource if you are looking to do even more in-depth life visioning processes. There's I use her arenas of and I use this a lot in my coaching too. She kind of splits up your life into like I think 10 or 11 different areas. That's an excellent book. Sonia Choquette's great, and Your Heart's Desire is a really good workbook for life visioning. Highly recommended. I would the other one I would recommend is The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. A great book. I actually thought about like the size of the book of Drummer in the Great Mountain was based on The Artist's Way. It's such a great workbook, creativity workbook. It's well known. Many of you have already heard of it. Definitely worth checking out. Prosperity Consciousness by Frederick Lehrman is the best money support audiobook I've ever heard. There's so much. I've blatantly mentioned a lot of that in the life visioning chapter. I referenced it quite a bit, so please check that out, especially if you're challenged with money right now. That is an excellent series. Just type in Prosperity Consciousness, you got it. And then I think on the spirituality end, for meditation, I mentioned Shinzen Young. I will post again the links if you go to the spirituality podcast. A couple podcasts back, you'll be able to check him out, and there's a couple links to him that I'll post on this podcast. And also this week, I've been listening to a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh, who's another outstanding meditation teacher, beautiful human being. And I just can't say enough about Thich Nhat Hanh. He's one of our great elders. Really worth, if you just need to relax and get perspective on your life, just bring in Thich Nhat Hanh, watch a YouTube video, and within 5 minutes you will chill out. You'll get perspective on what's going on. He's medicine. So definitely.
That's so important for the hunter type because we
Yeah.
tend to spin. We tend to spin and spin and spin, and especially when we're in our unfocused mode, we're kind of spinning. We're that hamster in the wheel, just kind of running. And whatever it is for you, I mean, Michael's given you so many ways he was inspired and what goes into the energy that goes into this book. Thich Nhat Hanh is great. That is one way I definitely center myself. And I have to say, in wrapping up, that to me is just listening to you kind of do this audio bibliography. Look, there are a lot of resources on this topic, right? We are never said we're the only one, we're the best one. Never said that. But those of us drawn to this, drawn to the drummer in the Great Mountain and what is transpiring from it, the community that's building around this, the podcast, the webinars coming up, all these things coming up. Part of the reason I believe, again, this is an unbiased view, it truly is that it is not just a technical book. And I think that's what we're all thankful for you for, Michael, is that you look at your resources. A lot of this comes from a very middle of the ground, spiritual, practical. Look at all the different people you just mentioned today. Only one of them is in the technical realm, which is Thom Hartmann and the hunter-farmer theory. But the rest comes from all these beautiful different vantage points, and that's what's led to the diversity of the book. And I think that's why, for those of us vibrating on this frequency, that's why it works for us. So thank you for being just open to, as you approach this, being so open to the different ways of bringing this topic across.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And you know what? I mean, this is each and every one of us we're given what we're supposed to share. Like
Yes.
whatever your talent is, whatever it is you're here to do, when you do it, it's what you need to do. It's not about actually helping the other person. It's like, I need to do this for me. I need to do this to remind myself of all this and to keep myself on track. But it's part of my life. And I think as people especially as you get older, I've noticed that when older, and I'm, in my early 40s, but I've watched people, they get into their 50s, 60s, and 70s, when they don't have that outlet to share and to give back. It's part of the mechanism inside of us. And when we don't, we just get depressed, or we get locked into like, oh, I should have done this, and all these regrets about I should have done this. And really, it's just about giving back. It's like, if you're depressed and you're not feeling fulfilled, just figure a way that you can take what you have and give back in whatever way that feels like you're making a difference in the world. It's the best antidepressant there is. And it's really what we should all be if we make that the priority, I find everything else seems to click into place. So I think that's maybe a good piece to end on.
Beautiful. As always, you find a way to button everything up. Do want to mention, we mentioned this before, we're a small press, we're a small family. This is a small project. We have thrived off of your reviews and your support, so we just ask you for more of it. If you've been listening to this podcast and you haven't taken that couple minutes it takes to give us a review on iTunes or any podcast review we're on, or reading the book, you haven't hopped on Goodreads, these are the things that'll keep this going for us to keep bringing you more and more of this podcast as it expands, as we evolve. We've got now interviews coming up where you'll hear us interviewing someone on a specific topic, involving the topics of the book. So we've got a lot coming. We just need your help, and we thank you for those that have. For those that haven't, it takes really 2 to 3 minutes of your time after you're done listening to this podcast. Hop on one of these review sites, give us a review, share on social media. Those of you that have, some of you have actually on your blog put in a post about this podcast. We thank you for that. Engage with us on Facebook and all of that. Share with us different ideas of getting the word out. Get this info to different institutions, social workers, progressive psychologists, whatever way you think this will help. Because remember, as Michael just said, we are trying to be of service here, and that's the number one goal. As I said, Michael's got a talk coming up at the Dove Library in Carlsbad, so there's interest out there. This is helping people. And really can't say much more than that. But before I wrap up, just want to thank you as always, Michael, especially for this today. This was very enlightening, and thank you for this journey so far. And I feel like we're heading into chapter 2 of the journey on the podcast, so looking forward to it.
Absolutely. Thank you again. I'm always impressed with what you bring in and the perspective you bring in. It keeps me, if I had to just sit in front of my computer and just talk extemporaneously, this would not exist.
Same
this would
here.
not exist.
Same
I tried
here.
Actually did last year. I think I did one webinar, and it just talking into the air.
Doesn't work.
It's the hard. Some people can do it, man.
Especially not for hunter types. We thrive off each other's energy. So I appreciate it. You know, I feel the same, brother. I feel the same. So, drummerandthegreatmountain.com, as always, is where you can find us. Facebook links, Twitter links, all the ways we're asking you to engage with us and help spread the word is there. Give us feedback. Keep bringing those stories. Remember, you can share with Michael a personal story on a private message through Twitter, through Facebook. We never, ever reveal anyone personally. We just use the stories as a spark for how maybe we should do the next podcast. Who should we interview? Wow, it looks like we're getting a lot of feedback on this one topic. It sounds like our community wants to hear about this. Don't be shy about sharing. We have no reason to share any personal information. We never would. We just want to hear your stories. So continue with that. Continue inspiring us, and we will continue to give back the same. So as always, we say on the Drummer and the Great Mountain podcast, please take care of yourselves and your health. Be well.
Thanks for tuning in. This podcast is intended solely for the purpose of personal growth and not as a replacement for professional psychological support. The views and opinions of the hosts and guests of this show are not meant to be taken as medical advice. It is very important to seek the help of a qualified medical practitioner when making any shifts to psychiatric medication you may be taking, or if you are experiencing extreme psychological distress.